Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. On today's episode, we're discussing perfectionism and stress in the physical therapy student. Stress and burnout in the PT profession is a personal interest of mine. I've done some research and explored how to use ACT in preventing burnout and creating resiliency in physical therapists. And we briefly explored this topic of perfectionism in episode 217 with physical therapist Dr. Andrea Moore. Andrea is a PT who specializes in treating women overcoming perfectionism and at the intersection between pain and perfectionism. Perfectionism is often caused by one having high standards or having a hypercritical evaluation of oneself. Some doctorate of physical therapy students experience increased stress when they go through the rather rigorous academic coursework that we take in physical therapy school. Yet there's really limited research in understanding the intersection between stress and perfectionism in the PT student, and what are the successful behaviors that these students have that help them manage this increased stress, especially those who are perfectionists coming into the program. Here to discuss perfectionism, stress, and the PT student is Professor Mike Richardson. Mike is a clinical associate professor in the Doctorate of Physical Therapy program at Hanover College. He earned his Doctor of Health Science from the University of Indianapolis, and his current research interests include perfectionism and stress among physical therapy students. On today's episode, you'll learn all about perfectionism and the prevalence among DPT students. What is perfectionism's relationship to stress and why it's important to better understand the relationship between stress and perfectionism? And then finally, what can be done? What strategies can you employ if you are a DPT student, or maybe you're a physical therapist yourself who is looking at the impact of stress on your physical as well as mental well-being? Okay, let's begin and let's meet Professor Mike Richardson and learn all about perfectionism, stress, and the physical therapy student. Hey there, Mike. Thanks for joining us this week on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. Nice to see you.
Likewise, I'm excited to talk to you about perfectionism in physical therapists and physical therapy students, especially, which is the center of our talk here today. And I have to say, looking through the literature, there's not a whole bunch on perfectionism in DPT students or professional physical therapists as well, licensed professionals. Why was this important for you to start to investigate and study?
Yeah, so you definitely do see more of this research in medical students. But, I was doing a Doctor of Health Science, and I've always kind of been interested in wellness, student well-being, stress, and, that's been written about for 3 decades now in PT literature. So I was trying to find something else that I could study. And, I think I read a newspaper article about kind of the evils of perfectionism or the negative side of it. And it really kind of almost was like that light bulb moment where I'm like, wow, we have these students that come in and we have these very high standards for them to get here, and just some of the things I read kind of reminded me of some students. I'm like, wow, there's nothing in the literature about this. Let's kind of see if the rates are similar in DPT students or PT students, as well as, some of the samples they've already looked at.
That's great. So really it was from looking at stress and burnout, but kind of taking that one level deeper and saying, okay, what else is there besides just kind of general stress and burnout, and what could be contributing to? And you came upon perfectionism. You already mentioned kind of, perfectionism can be dangerous to us as humans. What are the dangers of having a perfectionistic personality, so to speak?
Yeah. So when you look at some of the research, so some people will look at it in multiple categories, or at least 2 categories. And so some can be beneficial. Some can look at it as, problematic or negative. And, specific to maladaptive perfectionism among medical students, they found that was the biggest predictor of distress in that population. And then, once you look at the stress literature, then you have a whole other bits of health problems. You have cardiovascular issues, obesity issues, inappropriate coping mechanisms. And so it really can have this cascading, effect on not only our overall health, our academic performance. Like there's just so many negative things that can come about if you're on that kind of that problematic side of perfectionism.
And it is really interesting in the context of student physical therapists, because getting into PT school can be competitive, right? The prerequisites can be challenging sometimes. Oftentimes universities have a certain GPA requirement, and sometimes there are limited slots. And it's interesting to think back to, when I was applying many, many decades ago, but the spots were limited, and there was this sense of stress that continued even when people wound up in the program, obviously, when they were accepted into a PT program. So I'm wondering, as people are entering into physical therapy programs, are we aware as educators, on the DPT curricular level, that people may be starting a program with perfectionistic traits that may impact their performance?
So that's a great question. Actually, I think, obviously I don't know what all programs are doing, but I don't get the sense that they are specifically, looking at that. At my current institution, Hanover College, I know we looked at emotional intelligence and we did some other things. We have not looked at that specifically, but you do bring up an interesting point. We may be creating applicants and PT students that kind of trend in that direction. And maybe we should try to identify some of these students a little earlier, because once you start the program, you get into anatomy, your time is limited. Are we going to be able to teach them coping strategies at that point? Probably not. They just have to get through it. And so, could we identify some of the students that may trend in that direction earlier and make some suggestions prior to starting? Actually, they may be more likely to be able to incorporate some of those strategies that might mitigate some of that stress, some of that perfectionism.
Mm. And as we're talking, because we're talking about both perfectionism as having kind of a physical impact on the body, as well as a mental health impact on the body, or mental illness potentially, is perfectionism looked at upon as a mental illness, or is it more of a personality trait that one's born with, or one potentially develops through the environment that they're in?
Oh, goodness. That's, a little bit beyond the scope of what I've looked at. I don't know if it actually has been categorized, like on the psychology side of things. I know they've looked at this among adolescents. I'm not sure how young they've looked at this. It can go into different kind of dimensions in your life. And so, what I do kind of remember from some of the literature review is you typically don't have perfectionism in every single dimension of your life. It might be where you pull in your most, kind of self-identification. And so if you're an athlete, it may be in your sport. If you view yourself as more of a student, then it might be, with your grades. And so mental illness, I can't speak to that. I just don't know.
But there is a beneficial side to perfectionism for some people as well. Is that right?
Yeah. And so it really comes down to, kind of the acceptance and the tolerance. And so having high standards is important. But if you start to have extreme or unrealistic or excessive high standards, then that becomes the issue. And, it's always important to be self-critical and self-reflective. But when you start to become hypercritical, that's when it becomes a problem. If you are doing, some sort of practical or competency skills check and you kind of get off right off the bat, and then that spirals you to making more and more mistakes versus being able to, accept that, oh, I didn't do this perfectly. It's okay. I'm just going to move on. That's when we end up with some of the issues of kind of that maladaptive or unhealthy perfectionism.
So helping students identify with self-reflection, self-evaluation is part of being a student as well as a professional. But if it starts to go off the rails, if you will, then just being able to reflect upon that and saying, I may need some help, or I may need to pay attention to this part of my personality or my life a little bit more at this time. What has your research found with regard to the incidence of perfectionism in DPT students?
Yeah, so specific to the sample we looked at, we had about 40% that we identified as kind of that adaptive, healthy perfectionism. But we had about a quarter of them that we identified as having maladaptive tendencies. And so that put us at almost 2/3 of our class falling on that perfectionism spectrum. But I mean, we talked about it earlier, you kind of expect that we're going to have high performers in our PT programs. And so you do expect higher numbers of perfectionists in this population. It's similar to like a group of medical students. They were about a quarter as well for maladaptive perfectionists. The closest I could find with kind of PT students was a pre-occupational therapy group, and they actually found higher rates in that group for perfectionists in general, as well as maladaptive perfectionists. I think maybe a little over 40% they identified as maladaptive.
And have you seen that number in the literature? Is it consistent as professionals graduate and become licensed professionals, would you say? Or we don't really know that yet about DPTs?
So for sure, we don't know about DPT students. I have not, most of the literature has been done on undergraduate, some high school. You're starting to see a little more in health professions. I've not specifically looked at, once you become professional. However, I haven't stumbled across it either. So I don't think it's out there too much on a professional standpoint.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that it's kind of new, because there's a whole area of research where people can delve into and see what's happening with DPTs as they graduate and they move on into obviously clinical practice. What can we start to do either potentially before we enter a DPT program or maybe in a DPT program to help mitigate? What are the strategies that we can look toward?
Yeah, so, I think when it comes to strategies, I think we can look at it from a person level as well as a program level. And so, there has been a fair bit of research on stress management strategies, mindfulness with movement. You do a lot of work with acceptance and commitment therapy. We have some individual levels, and those have been successful, and we still need to teach students that, talk about that. But I think maybe the next step is, it's almost that canary in the coal mine. So we're doing some things to address the canary. Is it time to really start looking at the coal mine, the PT programs, maybe healthcare in general? What can we do to make it less stressful? But while we still maintain the rigor, obviously we want those high standards. We want that rigor. But is it a sequencing thing? Is it, how we set up our examinations or assignments? And so I think, a strategy might be trying to identify on a program level where these stressors are. Typically, you can kind of figure out, over the course of going through different cohorts, and perhaps you can build in a stress management curriculum that goes throughout the whole curriculum versus, one-time shot. And so, maybe it can precede an area where, it's stress for the students. Sometimes it's just disclosing to the students that, like, hey, this is going to be a hard semester for you, or this is going to be a hard 2 weeks. It's coming up. So, what can you do to prepare yourself and make that a little easier? And so it's kind of almost like disclosing, that information ahead of time. If you have parts of your program that are a little slower, maybe you can do something a little more involved with stress management. I think those are, just some of the ideas that are currently out there and some of the things that we can consider.
So a through line within the DPT program that includes stress management, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, maybe even emotional intelligence. I mean, there's some options out there for sure. Resiliency training that I've read about. And so we have we have some interesting options. Stress, we have a lot of stress information on health professions, student side of things, professional side of things. It'd be very nice to be able to teach some of these students while they may be more open to learning some of these stress management, so they kind of get some of these habits before they matriculate and become professionals. And hopefully we can address some of the healthcare provider wellness out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting to consider. So for example, let's say there was a mindfulness-based stress reduction class that, I don't know, ran for 8 weeks every year, right? What's interesting to me about that is the learning that obviously is good for your own stress reduction, stress management, but then we have tools that we could then use with our patients as well. So we're helping ourselves as well as learning, an evidence-based approach to potentially helping, let's say, a patient with pain or a patient with anxiety that may be interfering with their recovery. And some of that's been written into, I know I have seen some published papers where they talked about components of DPT curricula or even potentially some of the CAPT standards that start to look at things like mindfulness and stress with regard to the patient populations that we're seeing and treating.
Yeah, no, you're spot on with that comment. I don't think I could really say it any better.
Is there a way, so I'm interested because you said looking at the canary in the coal mine itself, because the coal mine of a DPT program exists. Obviously the program itself could be a coal mine, but then the university setting dictates some of that as well. So that's an even bigger coal mine. Have you been able to make any connections either through the literature or just, personally looking at stress of the faculty? Because I know a lot of faculty members are interested in stress and stress management and vicarious trauma that has happened over the past couple of years with regard to COVID and all the changes they've encountered in the DPT program. Is there any kind of, balance or play that's happening between the traits and personalities of the professors that impacts the traits and personality of the students?
Yeah, I have not specifically come across any of that, but I think we all know that how we role model to our students, is so important. And, you bring up, the last couple of years now with COVID, when we started this project, when I started this project, we weren't in COVID yet. And so we were collecting stress data as well. And so a very interesting thing, we were able to look at stress levels prior to COVID and then during COVID. And we found, unsurprisingly, that they went up in our students, but we also are starting to try to look at things beyond, just that typical white population. And we looked at Hispanic versus non-Hispanic students. And what we found was at the beginning of, or prior to the pandemic, the stress levels between Hispanic and non-Hispanic students were the same. Both groups increased when we took the measures again 10 to 12 months later, but our Hispanic students dramatically were more stressed than our non-Hispanic students. And, from COVID, there's a lot of stuff that was going on at that time. COVID, immigration issues, Black Lives Matter, digital divide, so many other factors. But we really need to start considering, kind of race, ethnicity, origin, when we're looking at some stress management, even perfectionism as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. So the trauma that we bring with us into the program potentially, and how that waxes and wanes as we encounter stress in the program and going to clinical affiliations, obviously moving into the professional sphere, all really important. I know you've talked about some of these topics like at the ELC conference, and I know they're being spoken about more and more at CSM, which they're all important topics for us to be discussing. On the topic of students, have they read your research, and what's some of their responses when they read it? Are they surprised by it? Or are they kind of like, hey, Dr. Richardson, like, great, now you have the data. What can we do, basically? Yeah,
so, obviously the students that were going through it at the time and can, agreed to participate, they were aware of it. And so some of them did come and talk to me. And, but, because we just have the article in press, we haven't really had a chance to roll it out to them very much. I've talked to them more along the lines of stress, perfectionism, probably more individually versus, as a whole, but we just haven't had a chance to kind of talk to them about that. I will have students that almost will self-identify as, I'm a perfectionist, kind of that student that, is conscientious, that they're studying hard, they're working hard, and then they bomb a couple practicals and you're talking to them and you find out they made that small little mistake at the beginning of it and just couldn't recover from it. And so then that is a great opportunity to have that conversation with that student at that time.
And I know you spoke about this at the ELC conference in Atlanta this year. What were your peers in the educational setting? How were they reacting to, your data, and what were the conversations that were happening around that topic at the time?
We really had a great response to that education session. And so it was a very enjoyable one to do. The conversation after it was very robust. A lot of them there, they were appreciative of the talk. I did have the question of like, well, I always viewed perfectionism as negative, and you're kind of saying there's a positive side. And that's kind of what the researchers are kind of talking about right now. But there are a group of researchers that kind of say, well, really, there's no healthy perfectionism. That's you're seeking excellence at that point. And so that person did have a very valid point about that. But, almost like what you just asked is, okay, so we know that our students have stressful times. It can be stress. It's been going on for 3 decades. It's almost like what's next for us? What can we do? So we, have identified a student who may be a maladaptive perfectionist. What can we do? And part of it is kind of knowing what our scope is. Is it to the point where you almost need to refer out and connect them to student services? Is it a conversation that you can have with them and hopefully they can maybe start reframing things a little bit? I was recently reading about a Japanese concept called Wabi-Sabi, and it's kind of the beauty and imperfection. I'm like, oh, what a great, reframing of something. And, perhaps it's just that discussion we can have with some of our students, with some of our colleagues on that, because although I haven't studied it yet, I do feel like it would be quite interesting to start collecting perfectionism data on faculty, on, clinical instructors, on practicing PTs. So there's a lot of data out there that we could look at and could collect.
Yeah, I like that because as you mentioned before, there's adaptive and maladaptive, but the word perfectionism is a construct that potentially is unattainable, correct? And that's the whole underlying thought of there is no healthy perfectionism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I grew up playing sports, and so it was kind of the practice makes perfect. And then it evolved to, well, perfect practice makes perfect. And when I first started teaching, I kind of brought that mantra into the students. And so, but now it's kind of evolved over the last few years doing this research, and it's, practice how you want to practice. This is a safe space to make a mistake. This is where you want to make a mistake. This is where we can coach you up. It's talking to students about, identifying the things that really, really need to have high standards, but also identifying things that perhaps good enough is good enough, and you can get it done and move on to something that's a little bit more important that does need to have those high standards.
Do you have a next step in mind for your line of research in this area? Is there
that's a great question. We only did it at a single institute. So, trying to broaden that out, I think would be very interesting to learn about. I'd like to do something where perhaps the next sample might be clinical instructors, because our students are kind of a good connector with that. So, that might work out fairly well also. And then, at that point, it's, so you've identified the incidence and the prevalence, so what intervention can we do to make a difference? And so that, is further down the line, but that's kind of the direction that we're looking at.
Is there an intervention that kind of calls to you the most? I mean, obviously exercise and physical activity is a coping mechanism for a lot of PTs, but I wonder if that goes deep enough with regard to this topic.
Yeah, PT students in general are a little more active on campus than most. And so a lot of them do get their exercise. And we know that there's a lot of good benefits with stress reduction with exercise and, mindfulness and yoga and, all those good mindfulness approaches. I really think when it comes to some of this, it's kind of that, reframing. But also part of it, when you think about stress, it can be very individual for a student. And so there's some students you need to teach them how to say no. Basically, they have signed up for way too many things and, they've just spread themselves too thin. And it probably comes from identifying, the students that what they might benefit from the most. Is it saying no more? Is it, reframing things? It's accepting and tolerating, coming up a little short, and that's okay. You learn from it and move on.
Yeah. I mean, the skills part of it, I think back that there must be some skills that we can teach new students coming into the programs, and maybe just awareness around the topic as you come into because it's interesting, as you come into a DPT program, you're encountering other students like yourself who have been highly successful in the academic realm. And some of them have at times stood out as being, the top of the class, but then they wind up in a program where they're now kind of all on the same kind of playing field, if you will. No one stands out at the moment when they start the program. So you're kind of what's the expression? A big fish in a small pond, if you will.
Yeah. I think you make a great point. They're in the top, probably, 10% or so of their class coming in. And now you have a whole nother ball game. It's almost going from playing, college or high school sports to college sports, at each level, it's more and more competitive and you may no longer be, at the top.
Yeah. I always remember starting PT school the first day and I met one of my classmates and she had just graduated from an Ivy League school. And I did not graduate from Ivy League. I remember feeling really intimidated around that area. And I wonder how much of those interactions can breed perfectionism versus do the right nurturing types of relationships help calm some of that perfectionism and make it adaptive, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I haven't come across too much of, what does it take to bring someone from a maladaptive side to an adaptive side? There is some suggestions out there. It gets more onto the psychology side of things with, cognitive behavioral therapy and, some of those things.
That's what I was thinking about before, as you mentioned that, there's a physical and an emotional cognitive side to this. As we kind of move into psychologically informed care in our profession, which we're well on our way to, it started with pain, right? Pain management. But can we now take those skills and apply them to other areas of our practice or in PT school? Like if there's a PT professor, let's say, that has some cognitive behavioral training for, let's say, chronic pain, are they able to generalize those skills to their students now and help them with, let's say, perfectionism or stress or sleep management, which can be a big part of this? Things like that all pop up in every area.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. It goes back to the modeling that we talked about earlier and, taking away almost that stigma of self-care and who knows if it's your yoga practice, you talk about it. If it's, you're feeling stressed, you talk about it to the students. So you create a vulnerability in yourself, but you humanize yourself to your students or your patients, whatever your population is. And that, there's a lot on Therapeutic Alliance, but there's also got to be that same kind of relationship building with students as well.
How has your research changed your relationship with your students?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like probably the empathy has increased. I know going through my Doctorate of Health Science program, I really got back into seeing the student point of view of things. So I think there's a lot of factors there, but I do think it's maybe having always felt like I don't want to come across like I, didn't have the empathy there, but I always felt like, I had the compassion and the empathy, but I probably better understand their point of view when it comes to certain things. I still have those high expectations, but I still feel like, I'm able to, communicate and listen to them a little bit better. I feel like that's occurred also with, I still keep a small patient practice going. And, I think it occurs there as well. I mean, you really don't know what some of these students and some of these patients have gone through, are going through, and you just have to be open to, they have a different journey than you, and you need to be aware of that.
Right, because perfectionism may be showing up in your patient as well. It could be
for sure.
A factor in their overall health, pain, function, how much time they devote to their care or not they devote to their care. So all really important.
Yeah, and I know your practice is a lot more with pain. I mean, that would be a very interesting population to study to see what type of perfectionist tendencies that population may have.
Yeah, I've looked into it a little bit, and there's not a whole bunch on it, actually. There's some information on perfectionism and chronic pain, more along the lines of the kind of anxiety trait and how that relates to pain. But, ripe for someone to do some research into, additional PhD work or some papers and books like that. There's a physical therapist I know who's actually been on the podcast. Her name is Andrea Moore, who is a physical therapist, and she's very interested in that area and has done some continuing education work in that area because she's seen it show up in the women that she treats.
Oh, very nice.
And sees it as like a component. So, what I love about this work is obviously it calls to us as, DPT students. Obviously, that could carry over into our professional relationship. And then we also see, as you mentioned, perfectionism could be showing up in our patient population. So 3 really important areas. Mike, it's been great speaking with you. Let people know how they can learn more about you and stay connected to your work.
Sure. Yeah. We do have an article in press through the Journal of PT Education, probably coming out early next year. I don't know the exact date on that. I'm also on faculty at Hanover College. And so, I can be found on their faculty page at Hanover College.
Great. So we'll link to that faculty page at Hanover College. And the paper that Mike just mentioned is the paper I mentioned in the introduction. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well, so you can all access it. I want to thank Mike again for being here this week and talking about perfectionism in DPT students. Make sure to share this with your friends and colleagues, especially in the world of physical therapy education and physical therapy in general. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.